And we're just learning that agents of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and Justice Department officials have met in secret with members of a Mexican drug cartel, all in exchange for information on rival drug organizations. This is all according to a new investigative piece reported by Mexico's El Universal News. According to the report, U.S. agents held more than 50 secret meetings with cartel operatives in Mexico for over a decade between 2000 and 2012, and they did so without informing Mexican authorities. The article says, without the presence of Mexican authorities, as bilateral agreements stipulate, without informing the Mexican government, the agents of the DEA met with members of the cartels to obtain information about their rivals and establish at the same time a network of informants of narco traffickers who signed cooperation agreements. El Universal based its reports on extensive interviews as well as official American and Mexican court documents. According to those documents, the U.S. specifically had an arrangement with Mexico's Sinaloa drug cartel that allowed the organization to smuggle billions of dollars of drugs, while Sinaloa provided information on rival gangs. Conservative estimates of the cartel's annual revenue is about $3 billion. And according to the head of the DEA's office in Chicago, quoted before this investigation, the Sinaloa drug cartel is responsible for supplying 70 to 80% of the drugs entering the Chicago area and has a presence in cities across the U.S. To discuss this undercover deal, I was joined earlier by Andrew Kennis, an investigative journalist based in Mexico City. I first asked him about these cooperation agreements and what these drug lords were promised in exchange for information about cartel rivals.
Well, first of all, there's a contention in terms of which drug lords had which immunity agreement. What we know for sure is that the leading lawyer for the Sinaloa cartel, Humberto Loya, as he's nicknamed Castro, had over 6 years worth of agreements with the DEA. These are called confidential source agreements. And there's no doubt these are documents that were released by the prosecution. And there's no contention on either side that this was and continues to be the case. In fact, even Jack Riley, the head of the Chicago DEA, spoke to me exclusively several times about this, and there's no contention there. Now, where the contention lies is to what extent immunity agreements like these apply to other cartel leaders, and this is where the defense and the prosecution differ. What Vincentillo, as he's nicknamed, you could loosely translate it as Pretty Boy, contends is that these agreements apply to him and other leaders, and that in exchange for intel on other groups such as Los Zetas, he had the same kind of protection that was afforded to their lawyer. The prosecution denies this. And he kind of spiced up the case, in fact, a little further, and actually also said that not just it was intel that was being exchanged, but that even there was fast and furious weapons as well.
Right, and I want to get to that, but before we do,
sure.
In giving the DEA information on rival gangs, was the Sinaloa cartel essentially getting the U.S. agency to do its dirty work?
Well, sure. I mean, in fact, even officials admit that this is literally dirty work, that having deals like these with leaders like these is dirty work, and security experts go even farther and say that arranging deals like these to strengthen one cartel over others so that there's less of a contention and disputed plazas and then therefore less violence is indeed a legitimate security strategy, and it's one that has to be done in a war that's pretty much hard, if not impossible, to win. And so this is their logic for doing these kind of things, and that's kind of the logic behind getting intel on a cartel that's been known to be much more despised by both the Mexican and U.S. governments, that is Los Zetas. They brag and routinely in narco mantras that they're the only cartel that doesn't have any agreements with the governments. They are known for the most heinous and violent acts. By contrast,
and I want to talk a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about that specifically. You know, during the height of this relationship, which was between 2006 and 2012, coincidentally, there was a marked surge of violence in Mexico, not to mention that the Sinaloa cartel saw a steady rise in power during those years. So do we know if this, could be attributed to the Sinaloa's cartel or the Sinaloa cartel's, tit for tat with the DEA?
I would paint the picture a little differently. In fact, during the height of the drug war, it became the case that, again, the governments were feeling possibly desperate enough to enter into agreements like these, again, so as to strengthen one cartel over the others and have in theory at least, the violence be reduced so that there would be more firm control over plazas and less street wars and turf wars and violence and so on and so forth. It's pretty well known that both in the key plazas on the border at Ciudad Juarez and also at Tijuana, there was some pretty precipitous drops in violence after the peaks when the Sinaloa cartel was pretty much roundly and mostly largely agreed to as having won the turf war. And so this is a strategy that's possibly linked to that, I would say.
And one of the things that Zambada Niebla alleged, this is the man who was on trial in Chicago for all of this. Is on trial, still currently on trial, thanks for that correction, was that the highly controversial Fast and Furious operation was all part of an agreement to finance and arm the cartel in exchange for information. So if that is indeed true, does this call into question what Attorney General Eric Holder knew about these agreements?
It goes even farther than that because, Eric Holder has been prosecuted and investigated for possible perjury about what he knew or not, and that's been covered widely in the mainstream news media. And so also, what's been covered widely in the mainstream news media is that supposedly these Fast and Furious weapons were lost, and that this was a mistake in the case. What hasn't really been covered that much is investigative work I've done, even though there's sworn congressional testimony on this, by, for instance, one ATF attaché who was based in Mexico City. His name was Carlos Canino, who described the fact that at one point, at the height of the Fast and Furious program, when there was over 1,000 weapons going across the border, 100% of those weapons, including ones that could be fielded to arm a small Marine battalion, it was even said, were going to, guess what? The Sinaloa cartel, and that's literally what the defense team for Vicente Zambada contends, was that this was part of his agreement, and this is additional evidence to show that he in fact did have an arrangement with the DEA.
And Andrew, we only have a few seconds left, but we know that U.S.-Mexican relations have been strained over the years and the approach to the war on drugs. What's your sense as to how Mexico might respond to these revelations?
Well, I mean, you know what? The revelations have been out for quite a long time, and the Mexican government has pretty much played dumb. They said that in fact, they've even expressed some concern or even some, anger that they weren't really put in the know. And since the revelations have been out, the confidential source agreement, for instance, which is no longer confidential between the leading lawyer in the Sinaloa cartel and the DEA, has been out there for almost 2 years now. Ever since that time, that's been the case. The Mexican government, there hasn't been any documents or proof to show that the Mexican government did indeed know. So it is possible that they were left in the dark on this one. That doesn't put the Mexican government in the clear about other aspects of the drug war, but when it comes to the Fast and Furious operation, and especially the arrangement they had possibly with Vicente Zambada, the contended arrangement, it doesn't look like they knew.
It's an incredible story indeed. We'll have to follow up with you on this in the future. Investigative reporter Andrew Kennis, thank you.
Thanks a lot.